In his autobiography, Frederick Douglass tells us about the men who enslaved him, and one in particular, Captain Thomas Auld, stands out. Douglass builds this incredibly powerful case against him, and it's not just about one bad guy. It's about power, hypocrisy, and a really disturbing idea that we're going to unpack right now. Wow, talk about not holding back, right? Douglass just comes right out and says it. This single sentence tells you everything you need to know about how he saw this man. There were no good days, no redeeming qualities. So what made Captain Auld so uniquely awful in Douglass's memory? All right, so to really get Douglass's main point, we have to start at the beginning. We need to understand who Captain Auld was before this big life-changing event happens. This is our baseline. So Douglass paints this picture of a guy who wasn't just cruel, he was also kind of pathetic. He was cowardly, insecure. See, he wasn't born into a slave-holding family. He only became a master because he married into it. So he was always just imitating what he thought a master should be. One day, he'd be raging. The next, he'd be totally indecisive. And that deep insecurity, it is absolutely key to understanding what happens next. And you know what? The people he enslaved, they saw right through him. They rarely ever called him master. Think about that. They denied him the one title he desperately wanted. It was this small, everyday act of defiance that showed just how little power he really had over their minds, and it drove him crazy. Okay, so we've got this cruel, insecure, disrespected man. And then something happens. A huge event that Douglass and the other enslaved people thought, just might change everything for the better. Captain Auld finds religion. It happens in August of 1832. Captain Auld goes to a big Methodist camp meeting and has a religious conversion. Now, for anyone living under his thumb, this sounds like incredible news. Maybe a man who finds God will become a better, kinder person, right? You can almost feel the hope in the air. So, just for a second, put yourself in young Frederick Douglass's shoes. This unpredictable, cruel man who controls your entire life has just become religious. What are you hoping for? What's the best thing that could possibly happen? Douglass had two really logical hopes. The biggest, most incredible hope was that maybe, just maybe, Auld's new faith would make him realize how evil slavery was and he'd set them all free. But okay, if that was too much to ask, the second hope was simpler. Maybe he'd just become a little kinder, a little more humane. It seems totally reasonable to expect that, doesn't it? But here is the shocking, horrifying twist in Douglass's story. His hopes weren't just disappointed. The exact opposite of what he hoped for came true. This is Douglass's jaw-dropping conclusion. Religion didn't make Captain Auld better, it made him worse. It made him more cruel, more hateful. So the huge question is, how is that even possible? How does finding faith lead to more hate? And this slide right here is the absolute core of Douglass's argument. Before, Auld's cruelty just came from his own mean, insecure personality. But after his conversion, he felt like he had God's permission. He found, in Douglass's words, religious sanction. It was like a holy justification for his evil. For an insecure man like him, that newfound confidence made him more terrifying than ever. Now, Douglass doesn't just make this wild claim and leave it there. No, he's like a prosecutor in a courtroom. He backs it up with cold, hard evidence. He presents specific exhibits to prove his case against Auld. Let's look at them. The first piece of evidence starts right inside Auld's own house, and it all comes down to something as basic as food. So, after his conversion, Captain Auld's home became a popular spot for preachers to visit, and he would put on this big show of being a pious, generous man by feeding them huge, amazing meals. But as Douglass says, while he starved us, he stuffed them. His holiness was a performance, and it was a performance paid for by the hunger of the people he enslaved. All right, Douglass's second exhibit. This one shows how Captain Auld and his new religious community actively fought to keep enslaved people in darkness and ignorance. So first, a quick definition. A Sabbath school was basically a Sunday school, and sometimes they were used to teach enslaved people how to read, often using the Bible. For someone like Douglass, learning to read was the ultimate key to freedom. Well, when some of the enslaved people tried to start one of these schools, guess who showed up to stop them? Ald's religious buddies, the so-called pious leaders of the church. And they didn't just ask them to stop. They came with sticks and rocks and violently attacked them. Their version of religion couldn't handle the idea of an educated slave. And now for Douglas's final and maybe his most powerful piece of evidence. This is where we see Captain Auld using the Bible itself as a weapon. Douglas describes a horrific scene where Captain Auld is whipping a young woman who was disabled. And while he's whipping her, he quotes this Bible verse to justify the beating. This is it. This is the ultimate example of religious sanction for cruelty. He wasn't just being a monster, he was being a monster who truly believed God was on his side. So after hearing all of that, it's really easy to think, okay, so Frederick Douglass just hates Christianity. But his argument is actually much smarter, much more nuanced than that. He gives us one more key detail. See, Douglas makes a point to tell us about another religious man, a preacher named Mr. Cookman. And Mr. Cookman was the complete opposite of Auld. He was kind, he treated the enslaved people with humanity, and they all believed he was secretly for emancipation. By showing us Mr. Cookman, Douglas is showing us there are two very different kinds of religion at play here. And that is the real takeaway. Douglas isn't attacking faith. He is launching a full-blown assault on the twisted, hypocritical, slave-holding version of faith. He saw it as a total corruption of real Christian values, a way for wicked men to feel righteous while doing the most evil things imaginable. And all of this leaves us with a really deep question, one that goes way beyond this story. How can the same book, the same ideas, be used by one person to justify kindness and by another to justify cruelty? It forces us to think about how ideas get interpreted, twisted, and used for good or for evil. It was a critical question in Douglas's time, and it's one we're still grappling with today.